I'm a union rep at a textile factory in Dhaka, Bangladesh. We'd just negotiated a 5% wage increase through our collective bargaining agreement. When an American consultant showed up to tour the facility, he watched me post the new contract terms on the bulletin board and went pale. He pulled the plant manager aside and said, "You're letting them form Soviets?" This is how Lenin started. I told him we were just negotiating fair wages through our union, standard practice here. He shook his head slowly and said that's what they all say before the gulags. He genuinely believed our wage negotiation committee was the first step toward overthrowing capitalism. His evidence was that we met weekly to discuss workplace issues, which he explained was literally the same structure as Communist Party, cells in 1917. The plant manager tried explaining that 70% of Bangladeshi garment workers are unionized, that it's how the industry functions. The American said that just proved how deep the infiltration went. He spent the rest of his visit taking photos of our union bulletin board like he was documenting evidence for the State Department. My cousin works at a BMW plant in Leipzig, Germany. An American exec visited for a factory tour and freaked out when he learned about their works council. The council's just a standard employee representation body that meets with management monthly about workplace matters, safety concerns, production schedules. The American exec interrupted the presentation and said, "So you've institutionalized the workers' collective. That's Marxist infrastructure." The German HR director tried explaining that works councils are mandated by law across Germany, that they're separate from unions, and actually reduce workplace conflicts. The American said mandated by law? So the government forces companies to create communist organizations? He started lecturing about how this explained Germany's decline despite the fact that Germany's a top 3 economy in the world. He said BMW should shut down the Works Council immediately, before the workers seized the means of production. The German plant director pointed out they'd had works councils since 1952, and BMW's doing fine. The Americans said 70 years was exactly how long it took for communism to fully take hold, and they were just months away from going full Venezuela. He filed a report recommending BMW's American division avoid all German business practices to prevent ideological contamination. I worked the service desk at a department store in Melbourne, Australia. An American couple was shopping when they noticed our union-negotiated wage scale posted near the break room. The wife grabbed her husband's arm and said they're advertising their communist wages right on the wall. He took photos with his phone, muttering about how this would never fly in a free country. I explained that 90% of Australian retail workers are covered by collective agreements that set minimum standards. He said, so the collective decides everyone's wages. That's literally redistribution of wealth. I told him the company and union negotiate the agreement together, that both sides agree to the terms. He said negotiations were just performative and that unions control everything. His wife asked if we had to attend mandatory political education sessions about class struggle. I said no. We just sometimes have union meetings during break time to vote on contract proposals. She nodded knowingly and said voting to redistribute resources. Classic Marxist-Leninist tactics. They left their shopping cart and walked out, saying they couldn't, in good conscience, support a business that had surrendered to organized labor. On the way out, the husband said he was reporting us to the American embassy for operating a socialist commercial enterprise on Australian soil. I'm a line supervisor at a Nissan assembly plant in Yokohama, Japan. We were hosting American investors who wanted to understand our production process. During lunch, they asked about our enterprise union, which represents all our workers and meets regularly with management. One investor's face went red, and he said, "You've got a communist union inside your factory." I explained that 99% of Japanese union members belong to enterprise unions organized at the company level, that ours negotiates wages during the annual spring offensive. He said spring offensive? That sounds like military terminology from the Cold War. I told him it's just the traditional name for our coordinated wage bargaining season every March when unions across Japan submit their demands together. He said coordinated demands across an entire country was central planning by another name. Asked who in the government was orchestrating it. I explained that the unions coordinate themselves voluntarily to strengthen their bargaining position. He leaned back and said, so you've created a nationwide workers' network that coordinates to pressure companies. That's literally the definition of a communist international. His colleague asked if membership was mandatory. I said most people join automatically when they're hired. He nodded grimly and said, compulsory collectivization. You're basically describing a gulag with better cafeteria food. They left early to reassess their investment strategy. My brother manages a construction site in Stockholm, Sweden. An American contractor visited to learn about Nordic building practices. During the site tour, my brother mentioned that he's in the construction workers union, same as most of his crew, and that their wages are set by nationwide collective agreements between unions and employer associations. The American stopped walking and said, "Wait, you're management and you're in a union?" My brother explained that 67% of Swedish workers are union members, including many managers, and that it's normal for supervisors to maintain their union membership. The American said, "You've merged labor and management into a single collective?" That's literally how Stalin structured his factories. He asked if the union forced my brother to join. My brother said no, but union membership comes with unemployment insurance benefits through the Ghent system, so most people choose to join. The American said, "So they hold your insurance hostage to force collectivization." That's economic coercion, he asked, when Sweden had gone communist. My brother pointed out that Sweden's been capitalist for its entire history, has a market economy, and is one of the wealthiest countries per capita in the world. The American said wealth was temporary, and that socialist unions always eventually destroy prosperity. That Sweden was probably just 5 to 10 years away from total collapse. He spent the rest of the visit taking notes on warning signs to share with American builders. I work as a receptionist at a medical clinic in Buenos Aires. An American medical tourist came for a procedure and was shocked to see our union certificate displayed in the lobby. He asked the nurse why we advertised being communist. She told him that unions in Argentina negotiate contracts covering 70% of workers.
Oh.
That most industries have strong collective bargaining. He said, "So, 70% of your country works for the collective? You're already 3/4 communist." He wanted to know if we had mandatory union dues deducted from paychecks. She explained that yes, dues are collected automatically for union members. He said automatic deduction was taxation by workers' councils and violated individual liberty. She tried explaining that Argentina's unions formed in the early 1900s and played a major role in establishing workers' rights during Juan Perón's presidency. He interrupted and said, "Perón, wasn't he basically South American Stalin?" She said no, Perón was actually quite different from Stalin. But the American cut her off and said that all union-based systems led to the same totalitarian endpoint. He asked if Argentina had food shortages yet. She said no. Argentina is actually a major agricultural exporter. He said that was propaganda, and that socialist countries always lied about their food production. He tried paying in cash to avoid using Argentina's banking system, which he assumed was state-controlled after the union takeover. My sister's a civil engineer for a transportation department in Oslo, Norway. An American engineering firm sent a delegation to study Norway's infrastructure projects. During a presentation, my sister mentioned that she's in the engineers union and that her salary is based on collectively negotiated frameworks. An American engineer raised his hand and said, "I thought Norway was a free country, but you've got mandatory union salary controls." My sister explained that unions don't control salaries. They negotiate minimum frameworks with employer organizations, and individual companies can pay above those minimums. He said minimum wage floors set by unions? That's price fixing by organized labor. He asked if the government enforced these agreements. She said no. Agreements are between private parties, but most employers follow them because it creates industry stability. He said, "So businesses voluntarily submit to union wage demands because otherwise they face collective retaliation? That's industrial intimidation." Another American asked what percentage of Norwegian engineers are unionized. My sister said about 60%. He did quick mental math and announced that meant unions had seized control of over half the engineering sector. My sister pointed out that the other 40% of engineers still have good wages and working conditions because the collective agreements set high industry standards that benefit everyone. The American said that proved the unions had monopolized the labor market and destroyed competition. He concluded that Norway's infrastructure success was happening despite, not because of its union system. I'm a bartender at a pub in Dublin, Ireland. An American tourist asked why there was a union sticker on our cash register. I told him that most Irish hospitality workers are an SIPTU, the Services, Industrial, Professional, and Technical Union, and that we'd recently negotiated better weekend pay rates through collective bargaining. He said, "You've got labor unions running bars? No wonder Ireland's economy crashed." I told him Ireland's crash was in 2008 during the financial crisis, over 15 years ago, and that our economy recovered and is currently one of the strongest in the EU. He said that was impossible with union interference in every business. He asked if the union decided how many hours I worked. I explained, "No, my employer makes the schedule, but the union makes sure I get proper breaks and overtime pay, according to the contract." He said, "So the union controls your schedule indirectly by threatening your boss with labor actions?" I told him we'd never actually had a strike, that most disputes are resolved through negotiation. He said the threat of strikes was implicit violence, and that unions maintained power through intimidation. His friend asked if joining the union was mandatory. I said no, it's voluntary. But most hospitality workers join because union members get better legal support and workplace protection. He said better protection means non-union workers are treated worse, which forces everyone to join. That's coercive collectivism. They left without tipping, saying they don't support establishments under union control. My uncle owns a cafe in Santiago, Chile. An American food blogger stopped by and noticed a union poster in the window advertising a hospitality workers' strike fund. She asked if his cafe was involved in communist organizing. He explained that he's actually in the Business Owners Association. It's not a workers' union, but that he supports his employees' right to organize. She said, "You're an owner who supports unions? That's like a capitalist funding his own execution." He told her that 13% of Chilean workers are unionized, mostly in larger companies, and that unions help stabilize wages and reduce turnover. She said stabilizing wages meant eliminating merit-based pay and forcing everyone into collective mediocrity. She asked if his employees had ever gone on strike. He said no, they'd never needed to, because he negotiates with them in good faith when they have concerns. She said, "So you've surrendered preemptively to avoid strikes." That's exactly what happened to Rhodesia. He asked what Rhodesia had to do with Chilean labor relations. She said both were examples of business owners giving up control to organize labor and facing economic collapse. He pointed out that Rhodesia collapsed due to international sanctions and civil war. It's not labor unions, and that Chile's economy is doing fine. She said Chile's success was despite its unions, not because of them, and that once union membership reached 20%, the economy would crash. She posted a review warning Americans to avoid his cafe because it had socialist labor sympathies. I'm a security guard at a shopping mall in Manila, Philippines. An American consultant was meeting with mall management about security upgrades. During his presentation, he asked why we had union meetings listed on the employee bulletin board. I told him that security guards across Manila are unionized, and that we meet monthly to discuss safety protocols and wage concerns. He said, "Your security force is unionized. How do you maintain discipline?" I explained that we maintain discipline through normal management oversight, that the union doesn't interfere with day-to-day operations. He said unions inherently undermine authority by creating a parallel power structure. He asked if union members could refuse assignments they considered unsafe. I said yes. Workers have the right to refuse genuinely dangerous work that's standard across most countries. He said, "So the workers decide what's safe, not management?" That's insubordination by committee. He wanted to know who had final authority in disputes. I told him that serious disputes go to the Department of Labor for mediation. He said the government sides with unions over businesses. That's regulatory capture by organized labor. He asked the mall manager why they tolerated a unionized security force. The manager explained that most Filipino security companies use unionized guards, that it's industry standard. The American said that explained why the Philippines had failed to develop despite decades of American influence. The mall manager pointed out that the Philippines has been growing steadily and is now an emerging market economy. The American said growth was temporary and that union domination would eventually strangle development. I work behind the counter at a bakery in Copenhagen, Denmark. An American expat came in and asked if the Danish written on our pay scale poster meant we were advertising union wages. I told her yes. Our wages are based on the collective agreement between the retail union and employer association covering Denmark's service sector. She said you're forced to pay what the union demands. I explained that the agreement sets minimum standards, but our bakery pays above the minimum because our owner wants to retain good staff. She said so he's forced to overpay to compete with other union shops. That's anti-competitive behavior. She asked what happened if a bakery refused to follow the agreement. I told her that about 90% of Danish workers are covered by collective agreements, so businesses that don't follow them struggle to attract qualified workers. She said so the unions have monopolized the labor supply? That's cartel behavior. I explained that workers can still work at non-union shops if they want. They just typically prefer jobs with better conditions. She said the fact that workers prefer union jobs proved that unions had created a two-tier labor system where non-union workers were exploited. I pointed out that Danish workers generally have high wages and good conditions regardless. She said that was only because unions had forced wages so high that it hurt the poor by raising prices. When I told her Denmark actually has relatively low income inequality, she said inequality statistics were meaningless because unions had redistributed wealth artificially. I'm a taxi dispatcher in São Paulo, Brazil. An American businessman needed a ride and was confused by the union decal on our dispatch window. He asked if the taxi union controlled all transportation in the city. I explained that many Brazilian taxi drivers belong to transportation unions that negotiate with city authorities about licensing and fare regulations. He said so the union sets prices. That's centrally planned economy. I told him that fares are actually set by the municipal government based on negotiations with multiple stakeholders including unions, companies, and consumer groups. He said multiple stakeholders means the government picks winners and losers. That's economic intervention. He asked if independent drivers could set their own fares. I said legally no. Taxis have to follow the regulated fare structure to prevent price gouging. He said fare regulations were anti-competitive and that true capitalism meant variable pricing. I explained that Brazil tried deregulated fares in some cities and it led to chaos with drivers fighting over passengers. He said short-term chaos was necessary for the market to find equilibrium. He asked what percentage of Brazilian workers were unionized. I told him about 11% of formal sector workers. He said 11% have captured the regulatory system and forced everyone else to follow their rules. That's minority rule through organized pressure. When we reached his hotel, he said he'd be reporting Brazil's taxi system to the IMF as an example of creeping socialism. My cousin's a train conductor on the intercity line between Vienna and Salzburg, Austria. An American tourist was chatting with him and asked about his job. My cousin mentioned that he's in the railway workers union and that his schedule and pay are determined by collective agreements. The American said Austrian trains are run by communist unions. My cousin explained that the union negotiates with BB, Austria State Railway Company, about working conditions and wages. The tourist said State Railway Company? So the government owns the trains and the workers are unionized? That's double socialist. My cousin tried explaining that many European countries have state-owned railways that work efficiently. The American said efficiency under socialism was impossible, and that Austrian trains only ran on time because they were subsidized by capitalist countries through the EU. My cousin pointed out that Austria is a wealthy country that pays more into the EU than it receives. The American said wealth under socialism was temporary. He asked if the union had ever gone on strike. My cousin said yes, there'd been strikes in the past when negotiations failed. The American said so the union can shut down the entire country's transportation system? That's holding the nation hostage. My cousin explained that strikes are regulated by law and require advance notice. The American said regulations on strikes proved the government and unions were working together. When the train arrived in Salzburg, He said he was going to write a travel blog warning Americans about Austria's socialist transportation infrastructure. I work at a ferry terminal in Wellington, New Zealand. An American cruise passenger asked why we had union meeting schedules posted in the staff area.